quick disclaimer. My wife, while I was putting this sweatshirt on, at one point told me, maybe you should wear something different, and I thought about it. I decided not to, mostly because even though this is the same shirt I wore for the first book review, I'm recording the reviews for both books 2 and 3 at the same time, so whatever I end up wearing in the first of those will also be worn in the second of those, so may as well make it 3 for 3. Welcome back to the bookcase. Upfront warning, this is the second in a series of reviews of the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, so expect spoilers aplenty for the first book. If you watched my last video, you'll recall I have some pretty high opinions of Mistborn: The Final Empire, calling it close to, if not just straight up, my favorite fantasy book, period. I've felt this way, or something close to it, ever since I read the book back in high school, and I was super excited at that time to move on to the next book. But, being perfectly honest, I was not as on fire about the second and third books in this series as I was about the first book. Since then, I've gone back and reread The Final Empire multiple times. Even not super enjoying those second and third books ever really brought down my enjoyment of the first book, but I never really went back to reread the second and third books in this trilogy. So going into the second book in this trilogy, The Well of Ascension, on my reread, I was a little bit apprehensive because all I can remember from my first read-through about a decade ago is I did not like it anywhere close to as much as I liked the first one. Now, for the most part, I have been pleasantly surprised on this reread at just how much I enjoyed The Well of Ascension. There were certain details I was dreading that I knew to expect, and these definitely brought it down. But I would say most of the time I spent reading this book was a really, really good time. So what's this one about? Again, spoilers for book 1, since, it does come right afterward. It's been over a year since Vin pulled off the crime of the century by committing both regicide and deicide at the exact same time. The world is reeling from the revelation that the Final Empire turned out to be not really all that final, and new kings and lords are popping up all over the land looking to take charge of their own little piece of the crumbling empire. The capital and the central dominance is no different. Elend, Vin's idealistic boyfriend, has become the king of the central dominance, and has attempted to set up a new government based on the democratic ideals he studied in forbidden books for the better part of his youth. Core to his administration are the former members of Kelsier's crew who orchestrated the fall of the Final Empire to begin with. But their fresh new government in Luthadel is now facing a new threat to its independence: rival kings from other provinces. In this case, Elend's own father, Strath Venture, has camped a massive army on their doorstep, and intends to take the city for himself and restore the Ska people to their prior condition of enslavement. Worse yet, another army appears shortly after with similar intentions. See, everyone assumes that the Lord Ruler's treasury of Atium would have been hidden in the capital, so of course everybody is out to get the capital for themselves. Only problem for our protagonists is they've spent the better part of the year searching high and low, and they have not found any of that treasury in the capital of Luthadel. So with multiple armies looking to take them out to seize wealth they don't actually have, Vin and Elend, as well as the rest of the crew, have to come together and find a way to navigate out of this mess. But even stranger things are happening in the rest of the world, and Vin finds herself worrying and wondering if perhaps by killing the Lord Ruler, they may have set something even worse loose upon the world. Now there's a big change in focus on who gets to play main character in this story. It's mostly performed pretty well here. We still have Vin carrying most of the story as our primary point of view, and Kelsier has left the main character focus understandably, seeing as he kinda died. In his place, we have Elend serving as our other protagonist. Vin and Elend make up the lion's share of the material in this book. There are other viewpoints that we get in this book, however. In The Final Empire, the book, there were just a few of these in moments where vital events were happening at a point where neither of our main characters were present. A few of them were with Elend, actually. The Well of Ascension makes these much more a rule, however, instead of an exception. Other minor characters are now getting a more consistent recurring viewpoint in this installment. The big ones here are Breeze and Sazed. There's also a few other one-offs, but these are more akin to what's in the first book. We just get a chapter with another character, maybe an antagonist, just so we see what's going on with them. Again, important events that we need to know for what's going on that none of our main characters were necessarily there for. Ultimately, this book casts a much larger net for how many characters it wants to be telling its story. Instead of just Vin and Kelsier, we now have Vin, Elend, Breeze, Sazed, whoever else we need just to get the story across. Now, for the most part, this works out very nicely. Vin and Elend's parts are pretty much exactly as fleshed out as they need to be. Meanwhile, Sazed's sections are much less substantial, but are appropriately in-depth for what they need to accomplish for him and for the story at large. The only issue I have a little bit with is Breeze's part in this book. I should say I actually really liked Breeze's segments from his point of view, and I'll have more to say about him as a character, but my issue with his segments of the book is that they aren't nearly as efficient as any other point of view that we're working with. I guess this could kind of be considered a nitpicky problem. It's just that all of the other viewpoints are not just characterizing someone, they are showing the progress of the world, what's happening next. They're not just an eyewitness account, it's sort of a mix of witnessing, but also progressing the plot as it goes. With Breeze, all we're really getting is character work, and while it's good character work, it's just that every time we're with someone else, important stuff is happening, and whenever we're with Breeze, important stuff isn't really happening. Again, the problem isn't necessarily that Breeze's segments are bad, it's just that the way that this book integrates the progression of its plot into everybody else's viewpoint is so efficient, except I find for when we're looking at Breeze. Elend has this political story that's really tied in with the government that he's created. Vin has this highly personal drama with some spy intrigue. And Sazed is researching the possible end of the world, which is tying back into Vin's plot. Breeze is just sort of there. It's not that he's unimportant, it's just that what he's doing is never really moving the plot along. Everyone else is getting character development plus plot progression, but Breeze just gets character development only. It's character development that I still think is interesting, but nonetheless, it still sticks out to me. This is maybe not a problem for most people, I just think the big issue is a consistency issue. For me, it's just that Breeze is a character who isn't exactly what I would call the down-to-earth type. He's definitely an eccentric man, and he's a fun man to follow, but usually in situations like this, where we have characters who aren't really progressing the plot, we're following characters just to sort of see what life is like for some people. And while Breeze is interesting as a person, and the life he leads is decently interesting, I think we're just kind of seeing him. We're not seeing anything about the world through him, and that's where the consistency issue is. Everybody else is fleshing things out, and Breeze is just having his own character fleshed out. Now, as for the development of these characters, the main star in this book is Elend, with Vin sharing that spotlight. Elend has this whole thing going on where he has to learn to be a better king and maintain his throne. To that extent, he's got to learn about the real world and how his idealism sometimes just doesn't cut it. I like this in a lot of ways. We get to see someone who has good intentions learning how to make those intentions into reality, while at the same time not letting himself be trod over by others looking to seize his power. Now, alternatively, there's some weirdness here. Elend's plot can feel a little pro-monarchy at times, which I don't think is necessarily the intention, but it's interesting that Elend's biggest issue in this book is basically a dysfunctional parliamentary democracy. Now, to be fair, what's being presented here is a democracy which is itself dysfunctional because the power holders acting within it do not believe in it and just want to seize the crown for themselves. But to be balanced, there are parts of the story where the problems being presented are the issues in democracy itself, and the solution is often presented as having a strong king holding everything together. Now, there's a lot of opinions that can be had about that, but I'm just going to bring it all back to this. It is a good thing that this book is a fantasy book and not a political theory book. Ultimately, I like what's going on with Elend's story. It works really well because it's less about him seizing control of the government, and it's more about him learning to make hard decisions and to get people to believe in him, that he is someone who can make those hard decisions and who can hold things together. Overall, I really like Elend's development in this book. I think it's one of the highlights. He's a very different character at the end of this book than he was at the beginning in more ways than one, but we're getting ahead of ourselves at that point. Let's talk about Vin. Vin is having this character arc that largely forms around her inability to be honest with other people and herself. As you might remember, Vin is more than a bit distrustful, and she hasn't been cured of that completely. She's also being torn a bit between different aspects of herself at the moment. She's torn between the different sides of her that make up who she is and which one is the most real. Because you've got the street urchin, the noblewoman, the mistborn soaring through the mists. All of these parts of her, she's not sure which one is the real face of her. Now, another character comes into this to complicate things, but we will get to him in a minute. All of this is to say that Vin is still looking for her place in the world. When she itches to do something, to take action, and her friends, Elend included, urge patience and diplomacy, she feels out of place at times. For the most part, I do like the direction her story takes here. Vin's end goal is to overcome her own fear of being vulnerable, to learn to open herself up to other people, and we're rooting for her as she's getting there. In addition to that, it involves beginning to learn that the contradictory parts of her, the street urchin who goes unnoticed in a cap and trousers, the lady who wears elaborate ball gowns, and the assassin, the ferocious warrior soaring through the night on the mists, those parts of her are all equally valid. They are not mutually exclusive. This story shows a lot of Vin really coming into herself as that weird little gremlin person I said she was in my last review. But the journey getting there is a little rough. Which leads me to the worst part of this book. Zane is a new character introduced in this book, and he is the worst thing about the Well of Ascension. Arguably, he's the worst thing about the Mistborn trilogy. The problem with Zane is less what he does and more the way he affects Vin. Now, this isn't to say that Zane is a good character. He's okay at best and annoying at worst. Zane is the Mistborn who theoretically answers to Elend's father, Stref Venture, the man leading one of the armies besieging the city. The easy way to summarize what annoys me about Zane is that he is what turns the romance subplot into a love triangle. I generally dislike love triangles, and what is being presented here is not a good one. See, Zane has this uncanny ability to cause Vin to make the dumbest possible decision at any given time, and to make matters worse, or perhaps better, Zane is an absolute edgelord. At one point, while thinking about Vin, he is literally musing something to the effect of, "Maybe she's the one who can save me." This was the point of the book where, in the theater of my mind, Zane became goth. I was just kind of like, dude, you were not wearing eyeliner 5 seconds ago, but then you said that, and now you are. To an extent, visualizing Zane as the ridiculous edgelord he is kind of mitigates things. Like, some amusement can be derived if you look at Zane this way. Overall, though, Zane is the worst thing about this book. He is incredibly bad. While we're talking about things that are weird, though, let's talk about Breeze. Preface: I really like Breeze's scenes in this book. We get inside of Breeze's head, and while there isn't much plot relevant happening, we get to see the way that Breeze views the world, and he's a fascinating character. He's the kind of person who's constantly looking at people around him, intuiting their emotional needs, because Breeze's abilities are emotional allomancy. He can soothe away emotions from certain people, and he is always doing it. Whenever he sees someone, he's intuiting how they feel, what they need to feel, and he's soothing away the unnecessary feelings to help them do what they need to do. When it comes to his place in the crew, he's actually a very interesting diffuser of conflict, because the crew doesn't usually realize that he's doing it. That said, Breeze has his own sort of romance subplot in this book, and the part that I know that some people would take umbrage with is that the woman who he starts that romance with is much younger than he is. Now, there are people who have strong opinions about that on both sides. Respectfully, I'm not going into that at large, but this particular instance in this book is worth discussing. Really, the reason I'm bringing it up is mostly just because I know a lot of people really don't like that kind of thing. And it's one of those things where I don't want to recommend something to someone and then for them to get upset by that. This said, I do think there is something to the fact that this is fiction, and I don't think that the author is necessarily trying to make a statement so much as establish a dynamic. If we just look at the type of people they are, their character types, the relationship is pretty cute, actually. Alrian is someone who uses her allomancy to constantly affect everyone the same way that Breeze does, and is always constantly analyzing people to intuit their emotional state so that she can affect them in a way that best helps them accomplish what they need to. In the few sections of the book where we get Alrian's point of view, we actually see that the way she looks at the world is very similar to the way that Breeze looks at the world. They have an understanding with each other that really nobody else does. But I keep coming back to the fact that Breeze is in his 40s, at least, and she's in her early 20s at latest. She's definitely not a minor, but I can definitely get that making people uncomfortable. Again, I bring this up less as something that takes a point away from the book for me, and more as something that I know will be a big negative for some people. It doesn't make up a significant portion of the book's runtime, but it's there regardless. So let's move into spoilers. Standard spoiler talk rules apply. Time code being shown on the bottom of the screen now. Talking to fill the airtime. Go to that time code if you don't want to hear any spoilers for this book. The ending of this book is something that when I was younger I had problems with, but I think I appreciate it more now. Usually the ending of the second installment of a trilogy tries to go for that Empire Strikes Back feel with all the characters at their lowest point. The Well of Ascension kind of goes for this, but instead of putting the heroes at their lowest point, it kind of leaves them with a sense of foreboding of what's yet to come. A subplot in this book is Sazed and his research into the mists, which are lingering longer and longer into the day and seemingly killing people. See, when the Lord Ruler died, he told Vin that they had no idea what he did for humanity, and while they didn't think much of this at the time, Vin and Sazed now wonder if by killing the Lord Ruler they may have released something worse. This is, however, a subplot. It does have more dramatic effects later in the story, where Vin leaves the city to seek out the Well of Ascension, but for the most part, this is all set up for Book 3. When we get to the end of this book, most of the stakes we were dealing with get resolved, however. What we have to look forward to is the big world-ending stuff. Now that still strikes me as a little bit weird today, not the resolution itself, but how neatly segmented the resolution feels. Basically there's this feeling of, alright, we finished dealing with this problem, so now the other problem can be the problem. I think when I was younger, what really bothered me was just how little the world-ending stuff was addressed in this book. But with years behind me, I think I better appreciate how this book deals with the after effects of the death of the most monarch. I do still wish we had more about the mists and what's going on outside of the city, but the political part of the story is something that I appreciate a whole lot more now than I used to. Something I still feel weird about, right at the very end, is Elend becomes Mistborn, and I feel like that kind of negates some stuff. So at the end of this story, Elend almost dies and is saved by being made into a Mistborn with a conveniently placed Mistborn pill. I swear that makes sense in context. Now, not a lot comes out of that since it happens at the very end of the book here, but in some ways I almost feel like it detracts from what made Elend interesting as a character, namely his newly learned ability to lead and make difficult decisions. Being Mistborn does not take away these qualities, but it's a sudden addition that I recall disliking when I read this book initially. In some ways, it feels almost like a situation where the character just has powers now because the story says that they need to have powers. This will be something I want to talk about more when we're talking about Book 3, because that's where it's actually important, but it happens in this book, so there's that. Anyway, that is the end of my spoiler talk for this book. Overall, I actually enjoyed this book a whole lot more than I expected to. My teenage dislike for this book made me expect worse than I got, and I think there's two big reasons for that. Reason number one is that the Final Empire, the entity itself, ended. The Final Empire, the setting, not the book, but also, yes, the book, is such an interesting setting. The dynamics of the society and the thieving crews, it's just so fascinating. It's a setting that feels like it could be thoroughly expanded with tons of stories happening in it. And then it just sort of ends right after the first book. Like that, we've gone from Final Empire to post-Final Empire. I think as a young reader, that frustrated me, because I so badly wanted more of that setting that the first book gave me, and here's book 2 already, leaving it behind, and I kind of felt viscerally betrayed. Being older, I feel like time has healed that particular wound, and I'm a bit less inclined to dislike the book for what it isn't, and more inclined to enjoy it for what it is, and there is a lot to enjoy here. But reason number 2 is a big reason for why I don't think I remembered this book fondly, and his name is Zane. I have already talked about Zane, but I cannot stress just how much he hurts the narrative for me. It's like he's not in the right story sometimes. Vin is like, I love my friends and the life I have now. And Zane is like, but wouldn't it be pretty screwed up if you killed your boyfriend because we live in a society? And Vin's response is something to the effect of, oh my god, he has a point, that would be pretty screwed up. The things he says are so laughably edgy and flawed that it comes near to harming Vin's credibility in my eyes because of the weird amount of stock that she puts in this edgelord's words. If there is one thing that I think all of my dislike was justified for in this book, it is Zane, 100%. There are rumors that Mistborn is being adapted in some form at the moment, and if so, I hope that this is one of the big things that they change. Zane is too important to just remove from the book, but the worst aspects of his character are either unnecessary or can be worked around with some better writing. At the very least, make him look like he bought his wardrobe at Hot Topic. Come on, he's asking for it. All of this to say that this was the thing I thought the most about over all of those years where I thought I didn't like this book. I think this book is an excellent story in its own right now, and I want you to understand that this one character is so bad that he made me think I hated this book for almost a decade. The Well of Ascension is a book I've had complicated thoughts about for a very long time. For years, I never went back and reread it because I'd convinced myself I didn't care for it. In fairness, those 2 big complaints I have are still there. One of them is even legitimate, I'd say. Don't hurt yourself wondering which one. It's Zane. He's still in this book, and I still hated his part in this story every bit as much as I did when I was in high school. But having finally come back to this work and engaged with it on its own terms, yeah, I think this is a worthy sequel to The Final Empire. The me of a few weeks ago probably wouldn't have thought that. I was nearly of the opinion that the only reason to read the entire Mistborn trilogy, and not just the first book, was so that you could get in on the fun romps that are the Era 2 novels. I think I see things a bit differently now. And it makes me glad I decided to do this project to begin with. It makes me wonder what other books I remember hating that I might have dramatically different opinions on now that I'm a bit older and wiser. Now, I wouldn't say that The Well of Ascension has become my new favorite Sanderson book, but I think I've learned a new appreciation for it, and I'm looking forward to having my thoughts on the 3rd book in this trilogy challenged as well. So next time you'll hear me talking about The Hero of Ages. Thanks again for sticking around as long as you have if you got here. If you enjoyed this, leave a like or a comment, or subscribe if you want to hear more. What's a book that you read in the past that you hated, that you think you might be interested to go back and see if your relationship with the text has changed? I'll probably be asking myself that a bit more in the future, but for now, it's this one. Next time, we'll be looking at The Hero of Ages. If it's up or if it's gonna go up soon, you should check out our Dracula video. It'll probably be fun. Anyway, I'm Steven. This is The Bookcase. Now go have fun reading something.